But I'm really lucky today that we've got Khalid Abdalla, who's an actor, a producer, writer, who was a signatory to the letter and also helped organise the Together Palestine concert at Wembley Arena last year. You might recognise him from The Crown, Day of the Jackal and of course The Kite Runner. And his debut play, Nowhere, is in part a response to events in Gaza and his experience of revolution in Egypt, and is currently touring the world to critical acclaim. I've not been to see it yet, but hopefully. And he's also an honorary fellow of Queen's College, Cambridge. So Khalid, over to you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a real honour to be here, and it's always a real honour to stand in any form, really, in relation to the Marwan Barghouti campaign and in support of Arab and his family. As you said, I was one of over 200, I think the number is now rising, but one of over 200 cultural figures from across the world who have signed on to this campaign. Many of them figures whose names also kind of may not always have signed on to Palestinian, which is not, not to throw something at them, but it is a broad consensus issue when you read the names that include the likes of Ian McKellen and Annie Lennox and Rebecca Solnit and also the breadth of backgrounds. And it's an honour to have been part of that. There's the obvious glaring question: why are we as cultural figures needing to do that? And I think it's important to say this in Parliament, that with the exception of notable figures, many of whom are in the room, that part of the reason that cultural figures need to respond in this way is because there is an absolute failure of political leadership. And that failure makes it incumbent upon us, wherever we are, to move the cultural debate forward so that politics can catch up. It remains within certain segments of society controversial to say that what happened over the last 2 years, despite the fact that the UN Commission of Inquiry has said so, despite the fact that all the great humanitarian organizations have said so, despite the fact of the ruling in the ICJ and genocide scholars across the board, that this has been a genocide, what has happened over the last 2 years. And apparently that remains controversial in some sectors and certainly in government. I am someone, I assume, like many of the signatories, who have signed on to this campaign, who cannot accept to ever go back to a day in which this genocide, which has happened on our collective watch, happens again. And I want to live true to the words never again in their absolute meaning of being never again for anyone. The question, I think, for all of us is, what do we do over these next 10 years that mean we are never here again? It's taken 77, 78 years from a Palestinian context to arrive at this moment of global consciousness. And over the last 2 years, of course, the primary demands have been to have a ceasefire and end the genocide, which, by the way, still continues. Since October 10th, over 500 Palestinians have been killed. That is double the number of hostages who were taken. And the double standard there is glaring. Which is not to, obviously not to say that that's not also extremely important. It's not to diminish from the importance of the hostages. It's to say that the double standard exists and that the genocide continues, as we're seeing with Palestinians not receiving enough aid and so on. But we've been doing all of that. The question for us, likewise, is what do we do? Not what do we stop, but what do we do from a political point of view? And the obvious answer, who is languishing in jail and has been now for, 24 years, is Marwan Barghouti. He is the most popular political figure in Palestine. As we heard, his campaign, when it was the last time it was remounted, was from Robben Island, from Nelson Mandela's prison cell with Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Nelson Mandela himself said that Marwan Barghouti's case is exactly the same as mine. And that is what gives, not just that it gives both the moral and the political grounding to say that this is the kind of solution that we should be working towards. Not the Board of Peace type version of things, whether represented, frankly, in Donald Trump and Tony Blair and likewise, or the Netanyahu government, and this idea which comes from a colonial mindset of, like the British Mandate originally, that the Palestinians are not in a state to be able to look after themselves and deal with their own democracy. We just heard from Marwan the eloquence of that. So, just imagine if his father was speaking, not to diminish from Arab is a great speaker, But we know that the potential for the political leadership exists. That is fundamentally being thwarted on every level and has been since Oslo, certainly since the Second Intifada, which why did that emerge? It emerged because of the failure of Oslo. So Marwan Barghouti's release, as well as him being the figure, I believe, who really has the ability to unify and move things forward, it signals internationally and within Palestine and within Israel that there is now genuine efforts being made towards a political solution. Without that, then what you've got is the attempt to divide and rule, not allow a genuine leadership to emerge, not allow any genuine political possibilities to emerge, and so you can always point the finger and say, oh, well, who do I speak to, etc. No, there is someone very clear to speak to, and there is a reason why Ben Gvir, who, as we said, is sanctioned in the UK, who is the person responsible for looking after the prisons, goes in and points an electric chair at Arab's father's face to say, this is what your fate is going to be, and we'll never have a Palestinian state. It's because they are trying to thwart its possibility of ever appearing. So we, internationally, and particularly Britain, as the world of international law is being unravelled, have a huge responsibility to move forward. And that's what, hopefully, as one of 200 cultural figures I am trying to represent, and with also notable figures within the world of politics who are here today trying to move forward with.